Welcome to the Node.js Technical Steering Committee meeting for September 4th, 2024. We will follow our standard agenda of looking at the issue that was generated in the TC repo. That was issue number 1612. Before we get started, are there any announcements that people would like to share?
Everyone, I don't know if this was being already announced enough, but good news is we have the Collaborator Summit is confirmed. So if you are planning or thinking of joining, please, you are welcome. We'll be meeting in Dublin. This is open to collaborators. If you are not just collaborator and want to join, please let us know. And it will be in Dublin right after NodeConf. But of course, it's not open. It's open to everybody, not just people attending NodeConf. If you can't afford it to spend a full week in Ireland with us. This is the issue is 419 in the summit repo. And it will be November 7th to the 8th, 2024.
Yeah, that's great news. Thanks to the sponsor who's giving us the space. And
yes,
looking forward to it. I think there are a number of topics already submitted, but yeah, we should be making sure as many collaborators know about the summit and
yep.
For sure. So that is good. Let me find that link. Do you have the link handy in the...
Yeah, I pasted it in the chat here.
Ah, perfect. Okay. I will put that in the minutes. Good. Okay. Any other announcements that people would like to share?
Yes, there was a Node 22.80 release this week that Raphael did, which fixed the regression with UTF-8 encoding from 22.7, and I think there were some other bugs squashed and fixed. So yeah, if you're on Node 22, you probably want to pick that one up.
All right, just taking notes on that. Any other announcements? Okay. In terms of reminders, just please remember to nominate people for the contributor spotlight. I think for this quarter we had one nomination. Sounds like we're going to get an email, basically saying here's the nomination. Do we agree? And that can go forward. But as always, if you see some people doing some good work, please nominate them. On to CPC and board meeting updates. I see Joe's joined, so maybe I'll pass it over to you for a CPC update.
Yeah, I don't think there's too much to talk about. We did discuss the Discord server, and I spoke with Claudio after our CPC meeting, and he was going to talk to V. Carl more about it. Basically we're in favor of the idea, but the code of conduct is a little bit of a sticking point still that we want to just figure out how we can work forward with them. But yeah, I think other than that, I don't think there's any other updates. Correct me if I'm missing anything.
Okay, and just for people who haven't been in the loop on that one, it's like they have a code of conduct which is slightly different from the foundation one, and the discussion is whether we should, ideally having them unified is good. So it's kind of like that's where the one side is, and the other side is like, hey, are the changes really important? So obviously ongoing conversation to resolve that.
Yeah, and our suggestion too is the changes are fairly minor, so maybe they could be moved to some sort of moderation document, and then we can just keep the code of conduct kind of standard. But we'll figure it out and report back.
Okay, sounds good. Okay, so at this point, I would say let's flip over to Amir, who's here just, I think, to talk about closing out the fuzzing report in And I guess getting the okay, I'm guessing, to publish the final report, right, is the key thing you want to close on.
Yes, I spoke yesterday with David and Adam and believe the remaining thing that needs to be done is just merging the last fix. I believe I linked to the correct one. But once that is merged, I believe the plan is to update the report to indicate that those issues have been fixed, giving a screen across the board, and then move forward with publishing. So I think my main intention was just to get that on your radar and be here if there's any questions about that, or if there's anything that needs to be done on our end that we can help with.
Okay, so I think, I can take a look at that one to see if we can get that landed. And then after that, it would probably be an ask, like a final ask to TSC members to say, hey, is there anything else that we think should happen before the report's published? Here's in its final form.
Okay.
So I'll take the action to send an email. Once I take a look at the other issue, I'll take the action to send that around and basically get the, yeah, no objections, or here's some things that people are concerned about.
Yeah. Sounds good. And yeah, once that that lands, we'll get an updated report, which I will then resend to the TSC for review.
Okay, so I'll wait for that report. So we'll get that landed, we'll wait for that report, and then we'll send out the final, like, hey, is this look good? Okay.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay. Just take minutes there. Report. Okay, well, thanks for that update. We can
Pleasure.
then
Thank you for the time, everyone. Have a good one.
Yeah, bye. We can then move on to the depths V8 backport. Blah 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 blah. I think Matteo, you added that to the agenda. You want to take that?
Sorry, just a second.
Sure.
I was dealing with an issue. So sure. Let me take it. So issue number 4, 5, like it's not an issue. It's a pull request. Okay, it's a pull request number 54597. So it is what is happening as happened. We have node 18 is bundling a very old version of V8 for obvious reason, which adds quite a few of CVEs reported against it, mostly because it's part of Chromium. So, and the Chromium threat model means that they need to be able to run safely third-party code, while we don't. This is not part of our threat model. So, in essence, there has been a bunch of those, okay? And those has been constantly reported by, it's very often that these come up and they've been asked, and we have been asked multiple times to fix them. During some previous discussion with Rafael, which is not here, so sorry, I am talking about somebody that's not here. We were discussing and said that we were okay in having, people showing up and doing contributions to do the V8 backports for those things. However, Targos, Michael, said that it's not okay with this approach, okay, especially because it's not a vulnerability. Okay, like this is essentially just to appease the scanners, and it can cause multiple issues, even if it's not correct. Like even just backporting is not necessarily sure that it does not have any other side effect and cause problems. So, and I think we should just, I don't know, decide what the policy is, and make a good and document it somewhere.
Yeah, I think it would be good to document that. Richard has hand up.
Yeah, so the main problem that that was alluded to was that this is being flagged up in scanners. But even if we backport the fixes, it's still going to show up in scanners because the scanners are just looking at the V8 version. And we're not we're not going to change the V8 version to lie and say, node 18 or 20 has a higher V8 version than it actually has. So even if we do backport, even if there was just some miraculous thing where the backport could land, so this backport that's flagged doesn't actually even compile. So, it can't land anyway.
No, yeah, this is
not ready.
irrelevant.
So there's a whole sort of it's not ready, doesn't build, and even if it does build, how do we even verify that it even fixes the whatever problem, or if there was a problem. If the idea was to appease scanners, well, this isn't going to appease any scanner because the scanners are all working on the V8 version, which this isn't going to really move. And I think, it's kind of, it's like everything, whatever we get in, we kind of have to have a reasonable degree of confidence, especially if it's an LTS release, that it's not going to destabilize the LTS release. And I think, especially with V8, we have very few people that I think can make those judgment calls. And I would sort of, as a release, I would defer to them on that. So I wouldn't say that we'd have a blanket, no, we're not going to do it. But I think if it does happen, it needs to meet, quality standards and, like everything else, it has to pass the CI as a minimum. So, this, as far as I can see, the open backports, while we do, if people are willing to spend the time to try and get backports opened and, to do the necessary work, I think we can work with them to do that. But at the moment, if the PR is just open and it's not building or compiling, then, well, it's not going to go anywhere. Sorry.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, well, for me, the key point here is we are sending mixed signals. Okay.
Yeah.
And I don't think we should send mixed signals. So it's the reason why I put the node.js TSC, it's and put on the TSC agenda was because to avoid sending mixed signals. Okay. So but I don't think either Raphael or Targos are in. So we are a little bit at a loss on the people involved. So maybe we should table it for next time.
I think we could one possible policy, which I think could make sense, is that we document that by default PRs won't be taken because of these risks, because of the extra work, because of the risk, we don't have people who can really easily review them. So it would be on exception case that we would take a PR if we don't believe it applies to Node. And my question would be does anybody here have concerns with that? Because maybe we can talk a little bit about those if there would be concerns with that approach. I know generally we would like to be helpful and accept PRs, but it on the flip side, I can easily see the work and the risk outweighing that in this particular case, right? But I don't know what people's thoughts are. If there's strong thoughts no, we should absolutely try and make this happen, or what?
With my release hat on for Node 18, Node 18 is in maintenance, and we've specifically outlined in the release policy what the release team feels can land in a maintenance release. And mainly there is some wiggle room for discretionary things, but the policy is mainly security fixes. Now, if we're deeming that this is not actually part of the threat model, so it's not deemed to be a security risk to Node, by default, it falls outside of that policy for the maintenance release. So, it's if you want to put more words around that, it can, but it sort of falls under the existing release policy for LTS releases.
I think I can go next. So my take on this is that regardless of whether if we consider part of the security model, we should probably fix it. On the other side, though, if it takes a lot of time to fix it, and since we are towards the end of the lifetime of 18, since we are around 6 months out of the 18 months, maybe it might take an additional month to eventually craft this. I'm not sure how much it takes to do this, but if it takes, for instance, another month to release it, it makes totally no sense to me. I would skip it. If this happened, for instance, a year ago, I would say let's do that.
So Paulo, just like, but were you saying if it applies to our, like in this case, we basically said we don't believe this applies to Node.js because of our threat model.
I'm not very expert on this. I mean, if it applies to our model, then we should take a decision. If it doesn't apply, we don't even have to take a decision because there is, in theory, no problem at all. Even though we have the problem at this case of, like Grish is saying, that we have to deal with scanners now. We have to find a way to tell scanners somehow, you can't do that. If there is a way, I'm not even sure how they are doing that thing. So,
It's been this is kind of a long-standing challenge. We do have the Node.js vulnerability assessments repo, and that's kind of what I had in mind is like, it's a place people can collaborate and share to say like, well, this isn't really apply. And actually the people in this particular case opened an issue there. We had people chime in and basically it was, yeah, this doesn't apply. But it didn't quite, I guess what was in that issue didn't quite convince the auditors that they were dealing with. Later discussion, I think in the issue, if you see in chat, they're like, oh, well, like Michael pointed out, well, actually in this case, it's a feature which wasn't even turned on, so it really can't apply. That seemed to the end to convince them, right? But it's that, and I've even faced that as well. Like internally, it's like, it's very hard to convince your security people to take a risk. They're like, nope, I just want it fixed. And you're like, well, but it's not actually a problem. And they're like, well, that's not good enough, right? So I understand where the people are stuck, but on our hand, we don't want to take on more risk and break things when there isn't a problem too, right? Like, so if we were like comfortable that we can easily land these, is not going to cause us any grief, great. But like in this case, just the fact that it didn't build right out of the gate was like, ooh, that reminds us like, okay, there's a fair amount of risk there.
And I think another problem is if you're talking in general about V8 patches, a lot of them are not visible to us if they are security related because they get what's the word? They're sort of hidden from general public. And until someone opens an actual patch and says this is the patch that will fix this vulnerability, it's very hard for us to make a decision as to, oh, this is a low risk thing, or actually this is quite a complicated thing that could be very tricky to backport. I mean, we do find that trying to backport V8 patches to, the further back you go, the harder it is to backport. So it's hard to make those calls until you see someone propose the actual patch into the code base. So in this case, we look at it, and maybe this one, if I remember correctly, it's only a few lines, but fundamentally, like I say, it doesn't compile. So at that point, it's well, it's not trivial. And there's the risk factor, but that's the kind of thing where I think until they'd open the PR, it was very difficult to make that judgment call and say, no, we were not going to do it. Now, you could have a policy that tried to generalize, and maybe the whole threat model, again, because we do apply that to the current release in terms of whether a security thing meets the threat model, that might be a good way to at least start. And then the whole thing about scanners and the threat model, that applies equally to current releases and LTS releases, that if there is a vulnerability that we in V8 that we deem not to be part of the threat model, so we don't think it's a security risk to Node, then that would be a general problem, not specific to LTS.
There was a comment from Dries just asking if we don't accept this, what alternatives exist for satisfying the scanners? I think the problem is there's a bunch of different scanners out there. There's nothing we can do. There's no standardized mechanism to say like, here's a not affected list. Even in the CVE side of things, it's difficult. And I think it's more difficult in this case because they're like, these aren't even reported against Node. I think I looked at them. They're like reported against Chrome and then using V8, which then these scanners say, oh, well, I know Node uses V8, so I'm going to report it. So it's not even like we have a separate thing to say, no, Node isn't affected.
There's nothing to satisfy the scanners. Effectively, you're then going into the realms of whoever is running the scanners then has some process to, I guess, put like an exception or an amelioration on it, but the scanner itself would still report. You know, if the scanner is flagging something up, the scanner will continue to flag it up unless someone has some sort of process for like manually overriding or saying it's fixed. There's nothing that we would do that would automatically make the scanners stop reporting the issue, because fundamentally most scanners run off version numbers, and you know the version number is not going to change much.
And that's where like even landing them doesn't necessarily resolve that problem, which is kind of where some of the discussion was around.
And just to assess the effort, how much it would take to write the fixing PR? Assuming that somebody wants to do that, how much it would take realistically?
I guess we don't know. And somebody did write it, but it didn't compile. Like somebody who wanted to get it landed said, here's the fix, but then it didn't compile. I think the bigger question is how much work would it take us for us to review it and be comfortable it doesn't break something? That's the real concern, right? Like, you know, even if somebody's an expert writes it, I guess like if the V8 team wrote it and said, here you were, we might like be okay. But like if somebody out in the community just writes it and it compiled, then we're like, okay. I think that was part of the point is like, we don't have enough people who are like so so familiar with V8 that they would look at it and very quickly say, yeah, okay, that's safe, right?
So again, I think this is difficult to until someone actually sits down and looks at it and tries to make that adjustment, because it's calling functions that, you know, the compiler's saying this doesn't exist, which means that it's relying on some change that isn't in that version of V8. Now, it may be possible to rewrite the patch for that version of V8, but until someone actually sits down and does it, it's hard to say how much, you know, is it that there's some other API that could be called that's an equivalent, or is it that, no, there was a lot more work that needs to be done to do that? And I think in this case, what we're finding is perhaps the one person that, you know, we would trust to do that work is saying that, you know, he doesn't want to do that work because he didn't see the value in actually spending the time trying to make that assessment in this case. So, you know, it's, yeah,
So
I think, you know, we shouldn't get too hung up on this particular case. It's more, you know, I don't know. I mean, I feel that we have had a few, you know, instances of this come up in the past, but not so many that this has kind of overwhelmed us. Now, I guess maybe the concern over messaging is a valid one, and maybe that might be what we concentrate on. I mean, in this case, you know, unless someone is willing to put in the work, and it's questionable as to whether that, you know, it is worth it. But, you know, if someone actually wants to spend that work, with the proviso that even if they do spend the work, we may still decide not to land it, depending on, you know, how it turns out. You know, that's fine. It's up to whoever wants to volunteer their time. But equally, we can't demand people spend their time on things, especially if we're not deeming it an actual security risk to Node. Then effectively, you're asking someone to spend or volunteer their time. You know.
Well, after this consideration, I would say don't do in any case, because even if for instance, even if we find somebody tomorrow that is going to write the patch and eventually test it, we can't even guarantee that it's not going to break other things. And we don't want probably to spend in the upcoming months chasing bugs and following up what we broke on 18, consider that 18 is going to go away in April. I think it's that gigantic effort for probably maybe we can do something different, like releasing an official statement on our website saying, you know, for 18 we are aware of this problem, but we can't really do anything about it in a timely manner before Node 18 goes end of life.
But again, we don't even know if it's a problem. So the likelihood is it isn't. The problem is really that scanners are picking up things that, you know, we're all questioning whether those are valid scan, you know, they're valid things to be finding in a scan. So
I mean, it's just about the scanner. We can be very evil and we trick them. We change the version that we report on 18 and
no,
that's it.
we're not going to do that.
No, we're not good.
I'm
Yeah,
kidding.
there'd
I'm
be
kidding.
lots of other.
Oh, so I'm obviously kidding, but I do. But I mean, that's. But I see your. I was kidding, but I see your. I see the problem. I mean, there's no easy solution, unfortunately.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where like that vulnerability assessment repo, I think, is like maybe the best we can do, right? It's a place where it's not like we didn't put it on our website as an official statement because again, we don't want to promise too much here, right? Because like we've looked at it, we don't think we don't think it applies. We decided not to fix it, so that's what we've said. But like really, it's up to the end users to decide if the scanners told them something, to decide whether or not. But like they can look at this and say, well, like, okay, well, there's a conversation. We asked the B18. People said, well, with our threat model, this is what we think. That's almost, I think, the best we can do for people and provide a space where that conversation can have, where you can have that. Otherwise, like I think people have said, it's never impossible. Like, you know, there may be a case where it makes total sense. And like we look at the PR and it's like, yeah, okay. But like, I think maybe setting the expectation, because I think part of where Mateo's coming from is like, we said, hey, we'll take PRs. And then it's kind of like, well, actually, no. So it would have been better to say, you know, generally we don't do this. In an exceptional circumstance, you might get one through if you want to spend the effort, but like, you know, really most likely not, right? Like, because then they could have made a decision based on that. And if that reflects reality, then it's better to make that up front versus like, I know we always want to be really helpful and land things, but like in the balance of risks, it may be better for us to just say, well, yeah, well, we'd like to do things like this, we just can't, right? Like, you know, if and if more people wanted to show up to help make it safer, like if we had more V8 experts and people wanted to volunteer and contribute to the point where like we could trust them to do this, then maybe we could. My other thing too is in that vulnerability assessment repo, if we had more companies who like this really mattered to, they could take on a rotation and share the work of figuring out whether or not something applies or not, right? Like they could say, okay, I'm gonna, and that way it cuts down the cost of everybody doing it individually would be but we've
So
kind of
I guess
already provided the space.
one other avenue, I guess in the near future or now, is that that program about hero devs and other companies that want to run in that space where they're willing to port patches back to earlier versions of Node. That, you know, this might fall into that sphere of things where core doesn't, you know, we as a whole are not deeming it something that we will end up following through on. But, you know, if it is really important to you, and yeah, maybe there are other avenues you can pursue to get that, you know, possibly patched if it is that important to your company.
Yeah, or if you need more confidence that the assessment is correct, right? Like I know there's companies out there who will, you know, look at these and say, do they apply or not to the binaries that we ship, right? And not community binaries, but their own binaries, which I think would be the case in the one you mentioned, but there's other ones that do that as well. But I think like to kind of close this out, you know, the question is like, do we document somewhere that this is the, you know, our approach to accepting PRs or not in terms of this, and use that to help people understand the chance of them landing versus the work they do. Or I think, Richard, you mentioned that like there's already some documentation, but I'm not sure that.
My opinion is that the existing release documentation about what can land in an LTS release covers this. I invite everyone here to reread that and disagree and maybe suggest improvements if they don't feel it covers it. But in my opinion, you know, that the release policy says an LTS release is once it's in maintenance, it will be security fixes and then other. I'm trying to remember the exact wording, but there's something in there to allow releases to make discretionary, to land things at their discretion. But it is discretionary, and the expectation there is that that's not everything. That is that is something to be considered by the release team. Now, that's deliberately vague because the more prescriptive you try and be, then you end up with a situation where now the thing that we decide as a whole we do really want to get into Node 18 no longer fits into the prescribed scenarios. But the expectation is always that those would be exceptional. So the general case now for 18 is security things and anything that would make the life of a releaser easier in terms of, for example, we might take some of the dependency updates if they're deemed to be no risk. If there's like some risk that in the future there might be a security patch to a dependency further down the line, then having the dependencies reasonably up to date could aid that. But generally speaking, we stop taking things like features or other things that people always say would be nice to have in an LTS maintenance release. But I think as a release team we have to be a bit more firm and say like no. So I think there's always debate, even if the policy says no, someone can ask the question, but I think the expectation is that you can ask the question, the chances are it will still be no, but there's a non-zero possibility that maybe you could convince the team yes, but it is a small possibility and not likely. But yeah, I really think if people do feel that this is a policy thing, that it either has to be either in the release policy or maybe the security policy. I think the danger is writing down policies is, if we can't have too many places where there's policy, because then people won't know where to look, or we will start contradicting ourselves in different places. So the fewer places we have policy that people have to refer to, the better. And then, try and keep those to a minimum and then make sure that they cover what we think they need to be covering, that we can then point people to in the case of debates.
I think I pasted into the minutes the right one, Richard, and I put it in the chat if you can double check that that's the text that you were talking about.
Yes, it's the release phases. Yeah.
So that would basically say no for maintenance, but maybe for active LTS, right?
Yes, and it's a maybe. I mean,
yeah,
everything's a maybe, and it still has to meet, the barrier for a pull request into Node, which is it needs to pass the tests.
Sure. Well, yeah, that's obvious.
So that's all. I mean, to me, that's. I don't think we need to write that down, or if we did, I'd hope it was already written down. But I don't think that's specific to this question about that. That's a general. If you open a PR, it needs to meet this quality bar. And the other questions around this were kind of, well, it's being flagged in a scanner, and that's, while we'd like to be helpful, we're not going to go out of our way to break break anyone working on the project just to satisfy something that we question whether that is a reasonable assumption that's being made.
Right. The only about on the documentation is sometimes documenting that we thought about a particular case and it doesn't override this might help us remember in the future. But
yeah, and again, maybe in this, your point about trying to get the discussions, especially if it's related to vulnerabilities and scanners, trying to get those into that vulnerability repo, which I believe, I think you mentioned, this particular case it started
Yeah.
there. But then at least then you can document, we can go back to that issue and put something in saying, thanks for opening the PR, but on reflection after reviewing, it's not compiling, so it's unlikely to be accepted.
Okay, so I don't hear anybody arguing against that, like, hey, this is kind of unlikely that we should, like, these kinds of things, yeah, risk, reward, whatever, it's probably going to turn out to be unlikely. And at least going forward, we can be a little bit more, like, in terms of the answers we give people, like, hey, PR is accepted. Well, not in this case necessarily, like, not impossible, but again, like, just because of the case. And we can think about, if somebody wants to propose some text somewhere that, covers this case because we think having that would be useful, we can do that. But we've already got something we can point to, which is, at least for the maintenance phase, not likely to happen, right? Okay. Oops, and I put that under the wrong place, but let me cut and paste that into the right spot before I move on. The next one is expose Indici's proxy agent and set global dispatcher within Node.js. And I know, Matteo, you've added that. I don't know if you want to provide the context.
Okay, 2 bits. This is a 2 bits question. Okay. The first part is for Node 23. Do we want automatic support for HTTP _ proxy, the environment variable, by default for fetch? This is the first question. Okay. It's the most requested thing. Okay. And most of the time, this comes to and this is the most frequent reason why people are asking to have access to Undici directly from Node. Like, there's been a long number of issues of people that wants to be able to change the global dispatcher of Undici without having to install Undici, but using the copy that is part of Node. Because people tend to prefer not to install modules on NPM these days, and that's essentially the ask. Now, problem being, there are a few problems in exposing Undici entirely. And the problem, first one, which is not, the first one is, well, it has a rather largish surface API, which we can't really probably offer the same LTS guarantees that we have for the rest of the project. So in other terms, it's, if we remove something, it's probably going to out in the next major and not one major down the line.
Sorry, Matteo, say that again, the last thing. I missed that.
So Node.js has a policy that if you want essentially to remove an API, you first need to deprecate it in one version, and then you deprecate in one version, and then in the next major, in one major, and then the next major after, you can remove it. With Undici, we have been very freely deprecating things and in the same line, and then removing them straight in the major after. Or anyway, shipping significant Semver major changes between versions.
So like, unless you were really arguing for us to do that, I would say, like, it's probably better to stick with what we've got, where we don't expose it all, because it keeps the flexibility to keep that moving. In terms of the automatic support for HTTP proxy, are those tied together? Like, that's the only way we could, right? Okay, so So if the real ask is just to do HTTP proxy, is there a reason
It's very
why we
common.
wouldn't
It's a very
do
common
that?
ask.
Right.
It
So is there a
is.
reason we wouldn't do that? Like, is that risky, or what's the challenge on that? See Marco has his hand.
I am in favor of this change. My only question is that should we create a new namespace for Undici, like node dot Undici, or how that's gonna work?
Well, I'm in favor too, so for the record, and I would say two things we have to consider. The first one is that yes, I would say let's create an extra new namespace like node colon Undici for Undici, but we have to be very specific in the documentation, say that whatever change you make in the Undici global dispatcher will also affect fetch. That's something we have to make very clear in the documentation. As of the matter of deprecating APIs and so forth, I would say this is probably an early stage to consider. Is too much early stage to consider this thing, Matteo, because as of now, you upgrade Undici under the hood without verifying if any API was deprecated, but only ensuring that fetch continues to work.
Yes.
Now, if we declare that module to be experimental, which is probably what's going to happen if we choose to do that, then we technically could break it at any time, and that's it. I would say probably that we make very clear, even in the documentation, which version of Undici we are exposing in that module, and tell people, reference to the official Undici repository for the public API, and that's it. I mean, that's just a strategy. We, of course, can decide on that, but it's just
It's a little bit a subpar user experience in that sense, Paolo. Sorry.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, the documentation probably exists.
So if that requires a new namespace, the idea is that it could be experimental, but at some point needs to have the same Node.js stability guarantees. So I think it's fine if there is like a transition time when we expose and we make sure that we can make it experimental, do all the breaking changes, and at some point mark it stable, and then follow the stability of Node.
Matteo, you're next.
Yeah, that's exposing local Undici. Again, it's, I don't know. I don't have a good. It has a lot of issues. Migrating it out, like keeping it outside of core, enabled a lot of experimentation and quick iteration on the concept. It also enabled a lot of developers to contribute, and the barrier of entry is way lower than Node itself, which is great. Okay, and therefore we are getting a lot of contributions. It's one of the most active repos in the org. Okay, so it's actually it's great to see, to be honest. Okay, but nevertheless, this means is likely a little bit less stable than Node, and in fact, it has been a lot of back and forth between various versions in the past. Of we have a bug fix here. It's that by the time that it reached 20, it's the unit of backporting is the release. It's not just the fix. So it's been a little bit of a whack-a-mole to get all the fixes to 20. So, because by the time people start reporting the bugs, there is no more time for meeting a release in 20. And so things get deferred to at least 2-3 months at a time. And this is very frustrating for users. So it's a little bit unrelated to using the exposed unit internally, but this is the current problem that we are talking about.
Paulo, you have your hand up next.
Yeah, so for the record, we already have a similar situation, for instance, in LLHTTP, right? Because I'm basically forced to maintain 3 different release lines of up to 3 release lines of LLHTTP in order to accommodate fixes for the 3 release lines in Node. If we choose to expose Undici, we can start following the same upgrade policy for Undici that we follow for other libraries like LLHTTP. For instance, I cannot upgrade LLHTTP in 18 because it's in LTS. We can do the same in Undici. The downside is that we will have to start maintaining 3 different release lines for Undici. Since Undici is following semantic versioning, that shouldn't be really of an issue. It's just that we have to maintain 3 different release lines. That's pretty much it.
Then the question, Paolo, would be that if we do that, this is on the table, of course. If we do that, then we will be a little bit in trouble because then, okay, I'm putting out like when there is a new Node LTS major LTS thing, we basically cut a version of Undici at that time, and that's it. Okay, we only backport fixes there. No, nothing.
No, that's not what I do for LLHTTP at the moment. When we cut a release of, for instance, of LTS, whatever version stay there will stay there, and that version that it was already cut on npm, so it's not a specific action on that Undici release. If, for instance, there is a security report on that LTS line, then I will release. We have to release, for instance, a fix on Undici of that release line. Otherwise, we keep doing compatible semantic versioning upgrades. But we don't do on LTS, so it's not even an issue. I mean, at least that's how I do for LLHTTP. Maybe I'm already following a wrong policy and we have to change that, but that's another topic.
Okay.
So I had my hand up next. I just want to add my 2 cents. Like, I know we say experimental, we can break things, but we always are in angst when like we get a million reports that something is broken, and then we spend some time, and then we try to figure it out, and like, so I know although we try and keep our options open, like it's not as easy as, yeah, we'll just break things whenever, right? Like as soon as it's in Node, there's a higher expectation. I think part of the reason people want to use it from Node without having to import in other modules because they have a higher expectations. And so if we pull it in but don't reach those higher expectations, I think we'll get what Matteo says is like it'll be a subpar experience. It's not what people are expecting. So my take is like it sounds like Undici is still in that sort of like more rapid development phase. It's benefiting from being able to iterate quickly, cycle through things. And people can get it by pulling the module in if that's what they want. If they want the more, the thing that's in that phase, it's moving more quickly, but you get more stuff. So from what I hear, I still think it's better to say like, well, yeah, at some point it might happen, but today both Undici and the project are better off with it the way it is. And if there's like one thing that's like the pain point and we can easily expose just HTTP proxy, I don't know. From what I hear in the discussion, that still sounds like the thing that will keep everybody the happiest, really. Richard had his hand up next.
Yeah, I was just going to say LLHTTP is not quite the same as Undici because we don't directly expose LLHTTP to users. So it is a dependency that, powers the HTTP parsing in Node, but you're going through other classes to do the HTTP parsing. And we have in the past swapped out. So, before LLHTTP, we had HTTP parser there, and we did swap those out during a Node release. I remember that. That was incredibly, it was very involved, put it that way. But we did manage to swap the HTTP parser implementation because it wasn't directly exposed to users. In this Undici case, the ask or one of that, the ask of exposing Undici is users are going to be calling the Indici APIs directly, which means that you have far less maneuver for, changing things. Whereas in LLHTTP, what you're more concerned about is what are the external visible changes. And the reason that you have to maintain those different versions of LLHTTP is because some of the parsing stuff was deemed to be, it would leak through and break users. But, it's not necessarily because of the versions of Node. It's more the behavior that's broken. And you could still change some of the API surface area of LLHTTP as long as Node was adapted for it, as long as the external behavior didn't change. So there is a slight difference in that there's a layer in Node between the users and LLHTTP, which isn't going to be there if they ask us to expose Indici directly.
Mateo's hand is up.
So Undici it's essentially has three parts mostly. Okay. First part is one part is what we bundle in Node, which is all the web standard stuff, fetch, WebSocket, event source, all those things. Then we have a part which is the public Undici API, which is, to be honest, quite large. It has a lot of agents. It's very convoluted to some extent, very complex because it's a complex problem. Okay. If you want to have an HTTP client that works both for HTTP 1, HTTP 2, tomorrow HTTP 3, whatever, you need to have a model that is reasoned like a connection pool and not like a single one-shot back and forth request. So, which is what Undici does underneath. We have, all this system for dispatchers, which is great, but they expose some, very low-level API. And as part as our documentation, we say that these are like low-level methods. Okay, they need to be callable and stuff in public because so that the various implementation can talk, but it's more or less all of this is private. Now, so this is the three core parts of Undici. Okay. Now, the generic question that we are having is people are asking a way to expose the global dispatcher and access to the dispatchers, which frankly, having said that, they have been relatively stable in terms of API, minus the fact that we just changed them very heavily. So not on the low-level components, but in the exposed API, we added a bunch of new things and deprecated some old stuff that was not working well. So anyway, all of this to say, this keeps popping up every now and then in issues. So it's the question can also be we only expose a part of Undici. I don't know. Okay, we expand the part of Undici that we bundle, which is not all of it, but it's just a subset. Okay, and we keep doing a subset and slowly increasing that subset where we want to guarantee some more tight things, and we document it in the main website. We still need to document all of it, to be honest, on the docs, because we don't document much about fetch, and there is a lot of lore here that people don't even know that they need to call Undici to do these things. So it's which is tricky.
I'm gonna have to drop off, so I'll make you the owner of the meeting.
Oh, okay.
And I'll let you, if you can close out, there's only one more issue. People can stick around, but if you can take that on.
Me too. I would have to go off, Michael.
Okay. So I guess in that case, maybe we'll leave the discussion for that there. We'll leave it on the agenda. We don't have time to get to the doc experimental flag or global accessible APIs, although I think Chenzong's done a good job of putting that PR together, and it's probably mostly to ask people to take a look and see if they agree with it.
It's pretty good.
should be ready to land, I think.
Yeah, it's just adding to the agenda for awareness. So please take a look at your time. Thank you.
So at that point, I'm going to say thanks for everybody's time, and we will see everybody in GitHub and next time. Bye.
Cheers, folks.